This presentation explores the guitar's relationship with pitch. This may seem like a trivial, self-evident pursuit for those with any familiarity with the instrument. However, I suggest that taking a first principle, almost naive approach can reveal some deep truths about the instrument, how guitarists do and might interact with it, and the complexities which arise in standard and non-standard tuning. These, I hope, will offer some insights and implications to the instrument, which, despite our familiarity, or perhaps because of our over-familiarity, are otherwise hidden. Let us start by considering what it means to know something on the guitar. Let's take the famous Hendrix chord as an example. We might know where it exists on the fretboard, its familiar idiomatic zigzag shape. We might also be able to recognize and/or write the Hendrix chord on the familiar stave, arguing perhaps over enharmonic spelling. The Hendrix chord, of course, can be voiced in acoustic space and recognized as such. We might also conceive it theoretically as perhaps part of a dominant 7 sharp 9 chord, or half of an octatonic scale. This theoretical conceptualization in latent music structures can reveal important intuitive senses about the object. For example, that visceral richness we hear can be explained somewhat in terms of pitch set theory. The 4 notes of a Hendrix chord are the most efficient way of creating all 6 interval classes, a fact I realized decades after first discovering the chord. These differing perspectives suggest that a broad range of guitar activity and knowledge, such as performance, pedagogy, theory, improvisation, and composition, occurs in and between various conceptual spaces, ways of knowing. I find it helpful and illuminating to consider such spaces to be fretboard space, or F space, where objects are visualized, manipulated, and technically realized. Acoustic space, or A space, where acoustic sounding and/or internally heard events live. Notation space, with representations of musical objects in conventional staff notation. And finally, M space, a sort of theoretical space with latent musical structures, what we might just consider music theory, both declarative and intuitive, systems through which musical objects coexist and interact. This 4-space model gives us a more nuanced view of musical skills and literacy. It also identifies the mechanism in the old and anachronistic joke, how do you make an electric guitarist shut up? Put sheet music in front of them. But also in its counter, how do you make a classical guitarist shut up? Take the sheet music away, where presumably all activity is reliant on N space. This model also gives us a more sophisticated idea of what music literacy is. For example, Wes Montgomery is often described, not without a gender, as a natural gifted guitarist, despite that, or perhaps because he couldn't read music or know theory. However, recently circulated footage of Wes rehearsing a new composition with the Pim Jacobs trio reveals a wholly different perspective. Wes teaches the piece's harmonic structure to the ensemble by both playing and saying chord names in modulation intervals. He notices immediately, by ear, the pianist's misplayed chords, correcting him through verbal direction and demonstration. Here, almost all connections in the figure are fluent and active, except for those coming to or from N space. Given that the ensemble memorizes the piece in minutes through this instruction, and any sheet music prepared would probably also be memorized and then abandoned, it's hard to see here any inefficiency or deficiency of so-called literacy, nor in the musical experience for all involved. This model might also reveal that translation between spaces can be stronger in some and weaker in others. For example, fretboard harmony, the connection between M space and F space, and fretboard transcription, A space to F space, are more robust than sight reading, N space to F space in some guitarists. Translations can also be indirect, such as the sight analysis of big band playing, where players have to infer from the chart to a sort of real-time analysis from N space to F space via M space. Training and practice can increase fluency between spaces in sight reading, oral analysis, playing by ear, and so on. However, repetition might also contribute to unhelpful automated mannerisms, such as playing the same solo chords on every chorus, and a sort of fluency myopia where we become blind to opportunities. As de Souza clearly presents in the context of Rosenwinkel, a level of learning, knowing exactly what to play and how it will sound, can lead to an overly schematic and unsurprising musical act, and a redundant musical experience. My suggestion here is that there is a keen benefit to challenging, disrupting, resetting, unlearning, relearning, turning it upside down, and sabotaging these links between spaces. Let's see, for example, what happens if we take the fretboard itself as some sort of center of analysis, a musical abacus with fret positions like beads on a string. It can be used as a simple calculator. For example, it can answer what is a minor sixth up from E flat through visualizing or touching the fretboard. But the fretboard can also provide theoretical insight. For example, one might discover that any augmented triad shape can be made into one of 6 major and minor triads by simply moving any note up or down a fret. Another example of such pluripotency comes from the diminished seventh, where you can create, just from one shape, 4 different dominant seventh chords and 4 different half diminished or minor sixth chords, simply by moving one of the notes down or up, respectively. These shapes are no longer static, but interconnected, like stem cells or a sort of harmonic origami. This concept can be extended to include neo-Riemannian theory, where chords can be seen as connected together through their voice-leading proximity and not necessarily their diatonic or functional purpose. For example, one major triad can become one of 6 different minor triads through very minimal motion. And from one of these, a whole host of other chords can be discovered. These transformations are of course not exclusive to the fretboard and can be realized on any pitched instrument. However, the inbuilt structure of the fretboard with its strict voice per string constraint, together with its shape-based cognition and chromatic parallelism of frets, I suggest illuminates such transformations with a particular clarity and profundity in an elegant sequence of interconnected chords, like calculations on an abacus or a harmonic origami. So in this spirit of naive discovery, let's take a first principles look at the guitar fretboard and its affordances. These idiosyncrasies of the guitar, I suggest, are useful and wonderful constraints, giving the instrument its melodic and harmonic character and rich repertoire. These characteristics I term pitch repetition, pitch spacing, and limited polyphony. We'll take these each in turn. Goodrich's observation that on the guitar the average note has 2.8 locations and 9.2 possible fingerings is a witty reflection on the guitar's idiosyncratic pitch complexity, but is worthy of some investigation. Unlike conventional keyboard instruments, this pitch repetition, being able to find the same note in different parts of the instrument, is a combined function of how close the open strings are tuned, number of strings, and the number of frets. We can, for example, maximize pitch repetition by simply tuning all strings identically. Each note would have 6 locations. Conversely, if we wanted a guitar with 0 pitch repetition, the interval between each string would have to be wider than the interval between the open string and top fret. One would need a very short fretboard to achieve this acoustically, but it is possible digitally. Tuning systems exist between these two extremes, and this Goodrich number, the average number of locations for each note, is a useful comparative tool. To calculate this, we need the number of fretboard locations, which is the number of strings multiplied by the number of fret spaces, that is the number of frets and the open string. We divide this total number by the number of unique pitches, or continuous range. In most cases, this is the number of semitones between its highest and lowest note, but I use the clumsier term continuous range for the rare cases where there are gaps. Here is the calculation. A 20-fret 6-string guitar in standard tuning would have 6 times 21, which is 126 locations, and a continuous range of 45 semitones. And so a Goodrich of 126 over 45, which is 2.8. Any extension of the instrument's continuous range by, for example, dropping the lowest string or sharpening the highest string, would decrease the Goodrich number a little. For example, drop D tuning has a Goodrich of 2.68, and Antlaw's perfect 4th tuning, which sharpens the top 2 strings, has a Goodrich of 2.74. Conversely, we could increase pitch repetition by clustering the strings, as in Nashville tuning, where the lowest 4 strings are tuned up an octave, and the Goodrich is 3.5. This pitch repetition may complicate sight reading, but we are compensated by a broader range of timbral options, as well as the possibility of note doubling in chords. There are also registral affordances in this repetition. A note can be the top of a chord in open position or the bottom of a chord in 8th position, extending its voicing possibilities. One way to conceptualize this pitch repetition is to think of the guitar as a keyboard. A standard keyboard has, of course, just one instrumental location per pitch. But the guitar has repeated notes, and they're not evenly repeated. In fact, there's a sort of mountain where the middle E on a 24-fret guitar has 6 repetitions, and then falling away either side of it is a somewhat symmetrical contour of repetition. But where is the repetition on the fretboard itself. Again, it has an interesting shape to it. If you imagine the repetition as altitude, almost like isobars on a map, there's a high ridge across this diagonal portion. But this repetition falls away to areas with unique notes. The relationship to the stave is yet more complex. If we consider how we can marry the fretboard and the stave by drawing our strings and frets across it, here we can see that the repetition forms a beautiful diamond, the complexity of which goes some way to explaining the challenges a guitarist faces with stave notation. Quite beautifully, this diamond also has timbral implications, illustrated here. How musical pictures are represented in score notation, abstracted theoretical systems, and instrumental interfaces varies widely. They include left-to-right linear keyboard presentations, woodwind fingerings, circle of fifths, chromatic circles, the string per note layout of a harp, the bilateral symmetry of the mbira and kora, pitch surface representations in 2 and more dimensions, 8x8 layouts of electronic controllers, logarithmic distances to a theremin's antenna, and countless others, including, of course, the standard guitar fretboard and the vertical layout of the stave. As it happens, these two exist in a somewhat awkward relationship. The layout of pitches on the standard guitar's fretboard echoes the stave's horizontal lines and pitch ascension, but distorts them somewhat. But we should reject the bias implying that the fretboard is the distortion of the correct stave. Rather, they are two of countless equally valid pitch representations. A closer look at the stave reveals a bias in its vertical spacing, where vertical distances, for example from line to line, may represent either a minor or a major third. Whilst this fits the piano's inherent diatonic bias, the guitar struggles to align with this, either in its horizontal fret placement or in its standard tuning. We could tune the guitar strings to the lines of a treble stave, or rethink the stave so that it aligns with our frets. We have, however, other concerns. The fretboard's mixture of chromatic parallelism and a near consistent vertical string spacing produces enough complexities without trying to marry it to the stave. One might say that the fretboard is a broken, limited polyphony overlapping dual interval space caught between diatonic familiarity and chromatic consistency, which may not be a bad thing. Take, for example, our familiar Hendrix chord. Now the guitar allows us to transpose this horizontally whilst maintaining its shape and intervallic structure. However, in standard tuning, this is not the case. Moving the shape vertically will actually change its intervallic structure, a sort of struggle between M space and F space. In order to maintain the intervallic structure, we would have to have a different shape for each position. This brings us to the idea of shape consistency. And here I offer the idea of a shape consistency vector. which for each number of string blocks, we observe what adjustments have to be made to maintain intervallic structure, or alternatively, what variety of intervallic structure can be made with the same shape. It's trivial for single string objects. There is only one shape. But once we have a two-string block, we need two different shapes in order to maintain intervallic structure. For a three-string block, we need three. A four-string block requires three different shapes. A five-string block requires two, and with all strings, trivially, we need one. This sort of vector gives us an idea of the complexity and richness of a tuning. In fact, here's a sampler of 4 different tuning systems. Standard tuning has a particular variety, whilst a consistent tuning, like Antlaw's perfect fourths, has ultimate shape consistency. New standard tuning is surprisingly consistent, and Mariah's Tellur, interesting non-palindromic vector. There is no value judgment here. There are trade-offs. Consistency is fluid conceptually and physically, but a greater variety of voicing possibilities is rewarded by inconsistent vectors. Let's turn now to the guitar's engagement with polyphony. Played conventionally, the guitar has as many voices as it has strings. Each string is either playing or it isn't. This polyphonic constraint is used in guitar pedagogy as a mechanism for technical development, fretboard knowledge, and improvisational skill. Mick Goodrich introduces a single-string unitar exercise to the advancing guitarist to hear the direct relationship between interval, distance, and movement in space, to encourage horizontal movement and exploration of higher frets, to engage with the intervallic construction rather than shape of arpeggios and chords, and focus on specific technical challenges, including legato and positional shifts. He encourages this unitar exploration on every string before moving on to the 5 pairs of adjacent strings, exploring permutations of fingerings, and slowly earning the privilege and revealing the potential of all string access. Pat Martino's pedagogy engages with this string limit concept comprehensively by presenting all 64 possible combinations of string use as improvisational strategies to explore. He relates them with stunning insight to the hexagrams of the Ching, in which hexagrams are presented in every combination of broken yin and unbroken yang lines. A perfect representation of all possible patterns of string activation. I've recreated the concept here using fingering and string graphics to emulate the traditional hexagram symbols. I've used the elegant 12th century BC King Wen sequence where each pair of hexagrams are upside down versions of each other, or, if vertically symmetrical, shadows with played strings turning silent and vice versa. I've also linked these hexagrams to the shape consistency concept of the previous section. 2 numbers represent how many positions the pattern could be shifted in a vertical position and how many shapes would be required to maintain intervallic structure. In other words, 2-2 is a hexagram that, if shifted, has 2 possible vertical positions and in so doing creates 2 different interval structures. Or, conversely, would need 2 shapes to maintain intervallic structure in standard tuning. This allows the hexagrams to be used not just as useful constraints, but as mechanisms to learn and develop chord and scale structures. James Dean's research uses this lens of string constraint and position to unearth the fretboard strategies of expert guitarists, as illustrated here, as well as a targeted mechanism for development. Let's bring some of these ideas together to build a sort of taxonomy of alternative tuning systems, or scordatura if you prefer. There are in fact a non-trivial number of these, with just 6 strings chosen from a 3-octave range, with only 12 divisions of the octave. There are over 2.17 billion possible tunings. So let's just start with a sample of 8. For each of these are provided this information: open strings in standard notation, open strings as MIDI note numbers, the Goodrich number, the in position or underhand range, not including open strings, string interval, the average number of semitones between adjacent strings and their standard deviation, stretchiness, the average number of chromatic gaps when playing with 4 fingers in position, consistency, the number of strings that move the same distance from standard tuning, displacement, the number of chromatic shifts away from standard tuning, what I call barre drift, which is the offset from an octave between the lowest and highest string. It's the adjustment standard tuning makes so that this is at 0. Our shape consistency vector, where the Hendrix chord lies in this tuning system, together with its reciprocal, its intervallic identity when played back in standard tuning, a sort of fretboard Rosetta Stone, and the fretboard pitch replication map at the bottom. Note the beautiful consistency in both the fretboard contour and the shape consistency vector. The wayward low tuning causing a large zone of uniqueness on the 6th and 5th strings. The non-palindromic shape consistency vector with the extraordinary voicing possibilities. A perfectly unstretchy and consistent layout. One of my most profound moments was playing with my friend John Wheatcroft, a left-handed player. We sometimes swapped guitars, each of us playing upside down on our respective instruments. The feeling of discovery, playing the same old chords, but in a twisted, reverse way, was quite profound, and something I do on occasion and recommend to refresh and revitalize the connections between spaces. Perhaps not as standard as Robert Fripp might have hoped, a fascinating tuning system with a high level of consistency and an even pitch replication. Only 2 displacements here from standard tuning, and yet has a profound effect on voicing possibility. I've analysed dozens of systems, and each provide a trade-off between all the complex characteristics that the guitar offers. We will never run out. This is not, of course, the full story of the guitar's relationship with pitch. Harmonics and open strings expand the positional range of each tuning system in complex, non-linear ways. While a standard capo is a fairly neutral and consistent interference, partial capos, such as Catalin Koltai's magnetic microcapos, break the guitar's horizontal consistency radically. And digital technologies, such as my Fretboard remapper, can recreate essentially any physical tuning system. as well as extraordinary systems with frets of different values, even negative frets which descend as we go up the fretboard, and neutral frets which do nothing at all. And these frets can behave differently for each string. Essentially, the fretboard can be liberated from physical plausibility and become a nonlinear lookup table with any pitch at any location. Considering a range of a grand piano with 12 notes per octave, this nonlinear fretboard library would include over 10 to the 245 tuning systems. There are, for reference, fewer than 10 to the 80 atoms in the universe. And we haven't even mentioned microtuning. While this may seem like ultra-modernist ideas, in fact, the concept of a nonlinear fretboard can be found in 15th century German lute tablature, where every fret location has a unique name, demonstrating that the ideas in this talk are not modern concerns, but part of the endless interplay of the human, the guitar, and creative expression.